Che Guevara is one of the most interesting and controversial figures in history. Some believe him to be a martyr, a symbol of revolution and power to the people, whilst others believe him to be an evil, murderous tyrant.
If you find out who that guy is, you're wearing a mass murderer's t-shirt.
So who is Che Guevara? What did he stand for? What did he achieve in his life? And what is his legacy? Let's get into the details. So for those of you who saw recently, I put a poll out on the discussion section of my YouTube channel asking what content people would like to see me do. The people have spoken. For that reason, I'm going to be doing the character analysis videos this week. So to start off, I've been reading this book called Compañero, The Life and Death of Che Guevara by Jorge Castañeda. Hope I said that right. Incredibly fascinating book about an incredibly fascinating man. So I thought, what better and more controversial historical figure to cover in my first edition of this series than Che Guevara. How good is my Spanish accent? I won't bore you with all of the details of his early life, but Che Guevara was born in Rosario, Argentina in 1928. He was from a good family, he had a good upbringing, and was a very bright kid. Now, often when people talk about Che Guevara, they talk about this precocious, super intellectual, political phenom. And there's often a narrative about him being this young, hip revolutionary. But this is not exactly the case. Che actually lived through the most interesting time in Argentinian political history, and it was right as he was becoming a man. When Che was 18, Juan Domingo Perón was elected as Argentinian president. Perón was a very divisive figure, and I'm not going to go into detail about Perón's politics, although that would be a very interesting video. So if you guys would like to see me do a video on him, just leave it in the comments. Now, Che's family was viscerally anti-Peronist, and he began his studies at Buenos Aires University in 1947 in the Faculty of Medicine. At this time in the universities, there was a lot of anti-Peronist sentiment, and despite both of these factors and who Che would eventually become, from all reports, he was largely apathetic about the issue. In the book, it says the following: Che was neither pro or anti-Peronist. Rather, the entire subject seemed to be a matter of indifference to him. In the letters which survived Chechenya's enraged burning of most of their correspondence, there are only a few references to Perón, and comments on current events are notoriously absent. Chechnya was his girlfriend that he was pen paling. Furthermore, it goes on to say, the left was devastated by Peronism. Never again would the socialist and communist parties regain the working class base, small but real, that they had consolidated before and during the Depression. Speaking about Perón now, the author goes on to say, thanks to reforms that were both symbolic and substantive, minimum wage, pension systems, women's suffrage, social security, and paid holidays, the government was highly popular with workers. Thus its strength and the lasting, often implausible memories it left in millions of Argentinians. Moreover, in regards to Che's political stance at the time, an exhaustive search of all the assorted records of groups active at that time has not turned up Guevara's name as a member of any student organization. His sister also said that in relation to Peronism, he did not side one way or the other. He sort of played the sidelines. Che was not a student activist. Politics in general and Peronism in particular were simply not topics of conversation for him. At least with me, he never talked politics. Now that's a very interesting detail to know, that somebody who would go on to be not only such an important political figure in Latin America, but also the world, lived through one of the most divisive and tumultuous times in history in terms of Latin American politics, and he didn't even involve himself in the issue despite being at a university, which would have been one of the epicenters for political discussion in the whole country. So how did Che get involved in politics? Well, in 1952, Che took a year to motorcycle around Latin America. This is a time where his political stances would begin to be formed. Che witnessed unbelievable poverty in every corner of every single country that he went to. He interpreted this poverty as the injustices of a failing capitalist system. Furthermore, he also witnessed the solidarity amongst these poverty-stricken people, and living on a bare minimum himself at the time, began to form a disdain for materialism. Now, Che would go on to finish his studies, although the evidence is a little bit sketchy, before going on his next adventure. He would eventually wind up in Guatemala. At this time, Guatemala was going through a revolution of its own. Jacobo Arbenz had come into power, and he was rocking the boat in the country. America had a lot of corporate interest in Guatemala at this time, and Arbenz was putting in agrarian reforms that led to clashes with these US companies. And historically, that hasn't been a very friendly bear to poke. As suspected, the CIA would train and finance a revolutionary group to oust that government. Now, Che Guevara was loosely involved with Arbenz's government. He wanted to be a doctor for them, but it would have meant joining the Communist Party, to which end he said no. So obviously at this time, he didn't quite have the communist convictions that he would a few years down the line. And in the coming years, he would dedicate much of his spare time to reading about political philosophy and educating himself on these matters. Now, after this US intervention, Che was earmarked for execution, so he was obviously forced to flee. This was an important experience for Che though, because because his disdain and resentment for the US was largely created by this experience. And his anti-imperialist rhetoric and fighting against the United States was something that he would carry until his last day. Che ended up spending some time in the Mexican embassy in Guatemala, where he would meet a bunch of Cuban exiles after their failed coup. Che made fast friends with the Cuban revolutionaries and wrote about his admiration for them. When I heard the Cubans make their grandiloquent statements about serenity, I felt tiny. I can make a speech 10 times more objective and without commonplace. I can read it better and I can convince a public that I'm telling the truth, but I don't convince myself, and the Cubans do. Nico would leave his soul in the microphone, and thanks to that could fill even the skeptics like me with enthusiasm. Next, Che would find himself in Mexico, where he would meet up with his Cuban friend Nico Lopez, who would introduce him to Raul Castro and eventually Fidel Castro. Now understand this, Che was quite a privileged young man in Argentina. However, he was very intellectually curious and obviously had quite a social conscience as well. And when he saw wealth and power taking advantage of the downtrodden, he felt compelled to act. And the adventurous spirit that Che possessed would forge the path for him. We live in a time now where we can safely look back and say that Marxist ideologies of communism and socialism are demonstrably bad. They do not work and were responsible for the deaths of tens of millions of people in the 20th century. We also understand why it didn't work. We can look at all the different countries, all the different examples, and now put the pieces together and understand that this is an ideology that sounds good, especially to someone who's intellectually curious, but in practice is a terrible idea that is bound for failure. In the 1950s, however, this wasn't abundantly clear. These ideas were still being tested worldwide. The Soviet Union had endured World War II and had then expanded its powers in Europe and was now engaged in a Cold War with the United States. Mao was still well and truly in power in China and would be there until 1976. The Gulag Archipelago, which opened much of the world's eyes to the atrocities that were happening in the Soviet Union, wasn't released until 1973. So it's easy to look back now, especially in a Western country, with the advantage of hindsight, but it's impossible for me to sit here and say that if I was living in the 1950s in Latin America, that I wouldn't have been a communist as well. Who knows? And for a young, idealistic, intellectually curious man like Che Guevara, after seeing so much poverty and oligarchs and major powers sweeping up the wealth of Latin American countries and leaving peasants destitute, the idea of a redistributive system and power to the people must have been extremely appealing. And when he met Fidel Castro in Mexico, I can imagine it would have been a perfect storm. You see, Fidel was regrouping after a failed coup, and he was looking for people to join the revolution. It was his mission to liberate the people of Cuba from an extremely American-friendly dictator in Fulgencio Batista that had come to power via a military coup. At the time, it seemed as though Havana was a vibrant cultural center, and for some it was, but the way that Castro and his men interpreted it was that it was simply a playground for rich and powerful foreigners, and that regular Cubans were left in poverty. Batista controlled the universities, the press, and the Congress. He embezzled massive amounts of money from their soaring economy and manipulated elections, all whilst enriching himself and his friends, keeping regular Cubans under the proverbial boot. But was this really the case? Whilst obviously some of that notion must have been true, according to Discover the Networks, the economy was great, one of the strongest in Latin America. The average daily wage in Cuba for agricultural workers in 1958 was $3. The average daily wage in France at the time was $2.73, in Belgium $2.70, Denmark $2.74, West Germany $2.73, and the US $4.06. Cuba ranked third in Latin America for doctors and dentists and calories consumed per capita. Infant mortality rate was lowest in the region and the 13th lowest in the world. They were also amongst the most literate Latin Americans and had a vibrant civic life. In 1956, after much guerrilla training, Che Guevara, Fidel Castro, and their men, 82 in total, set sail for Cuba. After a number of complications, they were eventually given up by a guide, which led to many of their men being wiped out and the forces being scattered around the hills and mountains of Cuba. They would eventually find their way back to each other, however, and they would slowly start to rebuild the guerrilla army. They didn't have too much success recruiting peasants, although they did recruit some and had many sympathizers. And to their credit, they eventually managed to rebuild the guerrilla forces to the point where the Sierra Maestro region became a liberated zone where Batista's forces feared to go. And then after a few significant victories where Che Guevara would prove his credentials as an incredible guerrilla warfare leader, Batista fled Cuba and the revolutionaries were in power. Now this is where things get interesting, because they're not playing guerrilla warfare anymore. Now they're in a position where Fidel Castro is the leader of Cuba and Che Guevara is basically his right-hand man. Che, being somewhat educated, became kind of the brains of the organization. He was appointed as head of Cuba's national bank for 456 days, where he kicked out the American banks so that Cuba could have control over its own money through a state-controlled bank. He was also put in charge of a kangaroo court that would order the execution of several 100 alleged counter-revolutionaries. Even when those in his inner circle begged for clemency for the condemned, Che responded, and I quote, "To send men to the firing squad, judicial proof is unnecessary. These procedures are an archaic bourgeois detail. This is a revolution, and a revolution must become a cold killing machine motivated by pure hate." In 1961, the US government tried to overthrow Fidel Castro's regime in Cuba and failed. This became known as the Bay of Pigs. And that's another event that would require a full video for me to talk about. So if you want to see that one, leave it in the comments. This then caused Cuba to seek help from the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union obliged, with Nikita Khrushchev secretly deploying nuclear missiles to Cuba. These were to protect themselves from the USA, but also from US missile threats in Italy and Turkey. This would be known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. The crisis was eventually averted, and Che and Fidel would continue on in Cuba. So after the success of the revolution, and Che proving himself as a fantastic leader and somebody with unbelievable guts and determination, he then proved himself to be a pretty ordinary economist and rather brutal. But also there are question marks about Che's morals in other regards, and the following quotes will explain why. After the Cuban Revolution in 1959, he said, "We're going to do for the blacks exactly what the blacks did for the revolution," by which I mean nothing. During his first journey through Latin America, he wrote, "The Africans had maintained their racial purity because of their lack of affinity with bathing." An ironic statement given his notoriously poor personal hygiene. He also said, "The black is indolent and a dreamer, spending his meager wage on frivolity or drink." Guevara also referred to Mexicans as a band of illiterate Indians, and he was a notorious homophobe. He campaigned to have gay people imprisoned, and when they were interned, they were treated worse than the rest of the prisoners. One of the reasons he put these gay men in these concentration camps was because they were unfit to serve their mandatory time in the Cuban military. He referred to these people as scum. He herded homosexuals, priests, dissidents, and other undesirables into buses where they were taken to camps. A significant number of these prisoners never returned as they were beaten, tortured, and murdered. And in a camp where these homosexuals were sent, there was a sign that said, "Work will make you men," obviously influenced by the infamous slogan, "Work will set you free," on the Nazi concentration camps. This is why I chuckle when I see university students and protesters and SJWs with their Che Guevara t-shirts on these days. A lot of the things that they are supposedly standing for are antithetical to Che Guevara's beliefs. Sometimes you even see them with the pride rainbow with Che Guevara's head on it. And that one really blows my mind. I mean, obviously these people either have absolutely zero idea about whose face is on their t-shirt, or they're just cool with being so ideologically inconsistent in a world where accountability is rare. So despite these glaring flaws in Che Guevara's character, can we look at Cuba today at least and see a positive legacy? Short answer, no. Cuba today is a failed state. A beautiful island with so much unique and wonderful culture and so much potential, but one that hasn't been able to shake the authoritarian communist dictatorship. A legacy left behind by Fidel Castro and Che Guevara that will have Cuba languishing for years and years to come. Between 1959 and 1992, at least 2 million Cubans fled the country, mainly via boat, in order to try and get to the United States, with many of them drowning on the journey.
News media the world over broadcast this image: a dozen Cubans sailing for freedom aboard an old green Chevy truck. Luis and his 3-year-old son, Angel, were on board. He tells me he was scared, building the boat in secret and pushing from shore in the dark of night. But he was willing to risk everything for a better life in America. Fidel
and Che ruined what was a thriving agricultural economy by imposing collective farms. They became dependent on the Soviet Union and then eventually Hugo Chavez's Venezuela. And in the past 50 years, Cuba's export growth has been less than Haiti's. Cuban citizens are forced to wait in ration queues where the government rations aren't even sufficient, and there is little to no hope and opportunities for young people in Cuba. But despite the demonstrably tragic effect of the Cuban Revolution, Che Guevara is still regarded as a hero to many today, including many people in Cuba. Buena Vista Social Club, who have some absolute bangers, have a song called Hasta Siempre Comandante. Translated to English, Until Forever Comandante. For such an iconic Cuban band to be so in favor of Che Guevara speaks volumes. Che would eventually try and reenact his revolutionary success in the Congo, where he failed, and then he would try and do the same in Bolivia, where he also failed. He was captured by the Bolivian army and eventually executed. When he was captured, he said, "Do not shoot. I am Che Guevara and worth more to you alive than dead." And his last words were to Sergeant Jamie Tyrant, a soldier ordered to shoot him according to journalist John Lee Anderson's biography, Che Guevara, A Revolutionary Life. I know you are here to kill me. Shoot, coward. You're only going to kill a man. If those were his last words, those are pretty badass, I'm not going to lie. Now, like I said at the start of the video, there are people who think that he's evil and people who think that he is amazing. And one of my favorite quotes in the world is, "The line separating good and evil passes not through states, not between classes, nor between political parties either, but right through every human heart and through all human hearts," by Alexander Solzhenitsyn in the Gulag Archipelago. I think that if you look at Che Guevara's life, what he did, and the legacy that he's left behind, it's easy to automatically say that he was a bad person. And do I think that his effect on the world is a net negative? Yes. However, in the end, I'm not sure that really matters, because the symbol of Che Guevara is a motif of revolution, of power to the people. There's something far deeper there. He is the romantic adventurer on the back of a motorcycle. He's the handsome, charismatic, intellectual, guerrilla warfare waging revolutionary that died for his cause and has been martyred by his followers. This is the story of the alchemist in a way. Boy goes on a journey to find his own personal legend. It's the Lord of the Rings story, a call to adventure and duty. Despite what he did, this story is deeply relatable, possibly on a collective unconscious level. This is the hero's journey. The worst thing that his enemies could have done was kill him in that Bolivian forest, because whether they like it or not, they had a major hand in martyring Che Guevara and ultimately creating this symbol that resonates on such a deeply archetypal level. From my observation, you can say all of the terrible things that he's done and how much of a shithole Cuba is now until you go blue in the face. The reality is that that doesn't actually matter. The symbol or the motif that is Che Guevara transcends the worldly man. That'll be it for me today, guys. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you've made it this far, I really appreciate that. Please be sure to hit that like button and subscribe. If you want to have more discussions about these really interesting topics, then you can find the link tree in my bio, where I've created a Facebook group where we discuss a wide range of ideas and topics. So I hope to see you there. Until next time, guys, I'm Jake, and this has been Rattlesnake TV.